Welcome to Wadsworth History on Film, a program presented by the Wadsworth Area Historical Society and designed to record the oral history of Wadsworth for posterity. I'm Cesar Carino, your host, and our guest today is Pauline Bebout, a longtime teacher in Wadsworth, some 50-some-odd years back. Mrs. Bebout, today, I guess we're going to have to reverse the roles, because for so many years, you actually told me what to do, you questioned me, and you tested me. Now today I'm going to question you and test you. Now how does that sound to you?
That's all right.
That's all right. What, are you sensitive about your age, Mrs. Bebout?
No.
Would you tell us when you were born?
1915.
What day?
January 12th.
January 12th, 1915.
I was supposed to be born on Washington's birthday, but I got in a hurry.
You got in a hurry. Of course, that's always been your personality.
That's
You've always
my
been
trouble.
in a hurry. What, so then 1998 and January 12th, you're going to be
83.
83 years of age. So you're 82 right now. You're in wonderful shape. Hearing is good. Your eyes are good. You can walk fast. You can do everything fast. I actually had you as a substitute teacher some 55, 60 years ago. And I love to tell the story, and you're going to refute this, I suspect. However, we were studying multiplication problems in the 4th grade, and my teacher was Zelda Cooter. Do you remember Zelda Cooter?
I remember.
Beautiful, beautiful woman who had a difficult time with her eyes. I think she had some eye problems. And Miss Cooter, I guess it was, wasn't it? Miss Cooter. Miss Cooter was teaching multiplication by 2 numbers. And evidently I had placed a line under the partial product of the first, or under the first partial product, and you're not supposed to do that. And Mrs. Scooter said, or Miss Scooter said, now, you mustn't do that. And she was a very, very nice person, and she didn't in any way become volatile toward me. Mm-hmm. Well, she must have put on her notes there for you the following day when you came in to help us review that. Caesar might put a line under the partial product. Don't let him. So I did indeed put a line under the partial product, and you came up with me with a yardstick and whap and said, don't ever put a line under the partial product. Now that was probably in 1940, and this is 1997. It's 57 years ago, and I have never put a line under the partial product, and I credit you for that.
Well, I don't know whether I thank you or not.
Well, you ought to thank me for that. Absolutely. Absolutely. Tell us a little bit about where you were born and a little bit about yourself as a little young girl.
Well, I was born in Ross County in a little village called Bourneville.
And where's Ross County in Ohio?
Ross County is south of Columbus. Chillicothe is the county seat, and it was the first capital of Ohio, probably, right, if you read your history.
Yes, I did read my history.
And
you saw to that.
My dad was a teacher there in the Twin Township schools where I started to school.
Your father was a teacher. What did he teach?
He taught math.
Math.
He taught 6th grade a lot, too.
And what about your maiden name and all of that?
Arrington.
Harrington?
No, Arrington.
Arrington.
A-R-R-I-N-G-T-O-N.
Arrington.
Yes,
so this was Pauline Arrington.
Right.
And then you went all the way through those schools, and where did you meet Jim Bebout, who was also a teacher?
Well, I went, after going to Wilmington College, 3 years, I taught school in Twin Township, and he came there to teach school.
And where was he from?
And he was from Greenwich, Ohio.
Which is
west of here, just 40 miles west.
That's why we have Greenwich Road.
Right. And he was a graduate of Oberlin College, and he had taught 2 years in North Fairfield. And he got the job down in our hometown, so he came there to teach. And I jokingly say there must have been something about me that suited him, because there were 8 maiden lady teachers in the school when he came, and I'm the one who had him for a husband.
Well, it's entirely possible that those maiden lady teachers were all maiden ladies indeed, about 50, 60 years old.
Well, see, no married woman could teach, you see.
Well, why was that?
What?
Why was that?
Well, your husband's supposed to make a living for you, and if a woman took the job, then that left out some man who might want a job.
So in other words, if you were married, you couldn't teach.
And my first contract said that.
It actually said it.
Marriage on the part of a woman teacher immediately cancels her contract.
I knew that happened. As a matter of fact, I had a 1st grade teacher who whom everyone thought might have been secretly married. She never did get married. Bertha Kuhn, she never did get married, but they thought that she was secretly married. And there was some conversation that I can remember, that even as a first grader, about the fact that she might have been married. And then those of us who were in her classroom, or even the year following, probably wished that she would, or whatever, and we made up all kinds of stories about her husband and all that kind of thing. So you then met Jim Bebout.
When he came to my town to
He
teach
came
school.
down. What year was that you began teaching?
I began 1934.
1934.
And he'd already taught 2 years
63
then.
years ago you started teaching. It's a long time. And Jim started when?
He started 1932.
Oh, he had started earlier. So
And then he had 2 years out when he didn't have a job. He went to business college and worked in a bank.
I see. Then you, 1932, he was ready to teach.
Yes.
But he wasn't teaching then. And you came in 1930.
He taught in North Fairfield in 1930 to 32.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So he graduated from college in
In 1930. How old would Jim be now if he were living?
88.
88. And we remember him very well because I taught with him, as a matter of fact. Now, you got married. What brought you to Wadsworth?
Well, he had an aunt who lived in Akron, and he wasn't exactly happy in the little school we were both teaching in, and he came to Akron to visit his aunt and decided to go down to the county school office and see Carl Coffeen.
Carl Coffeen was the
county superintendent
at that time.
And he said, well, it's late in August, but he said, I have a job I bet you can handle. And they were starting at Norton High School, a commercial department that fall. Now this is funny too, because Jim had his main degree was history and political science, but he couldn't find a job in that.
No, I can't believe
And
it.
he had minor in math and minor in science, and that's what he'd taught the first 2 years. But then when he didn't have a job, he went to Mansfield to business college, and he found out there were jobs all over for business teachers.
And this was during the Depression, of course, when jobs were almost impossible to get.
So he could do the commercial bit, and he had to go back to school, but he just took proficiency tests. He didn't. He had to pay the tuition to get his degree, to get his credits.
Certification for accreditation.
But he got all of it that way. He just took his bookkeeping and his typing and shorthand, took all of those things, and got the certificate. And the first thing you know, he had a job teaching commercial, and that was the one. At Norton, they were just beginning.
What year was that?
1930. So he taught home. I always have to think. That was 36.
So he started teaching in Norton in 1936.
36.
So
right.
then you came up here in 36, is that right?
No, we came in 38.
On 38. Well, then he lived up here for a while by himself, or
Yes,
what?
he lived on Pardee Street with a family called Mr. and Mrs. Ellis Long, and he ate at Joe Bender's restaurant.
Mrs. Ellis Long, Mr. and Mrs. Ellis Long on Pardee Street, and ate at Joe Bender's restaurant every night.
Every night, and every morning.
And every morning.
He'd walk in, Joe would lay down the Cleveland Plain Dealer and bring his coffee, and
that would be it.
And then he'd know what he wanted. He'd find out what he wanted for breakfast, but the coffee and the newspaper came every morning as Joe walked in.
Now, it probably was the same Cleveland Plain Dealer.
Oh, yes,
And he would just pass from place to place. Joe wasn't known for being particularly, shall we say, generous-handed about some of these things, but he was a wonderful, wonderful friend and a wonderful person. How long did he do that? You were
2
married
years.
at the time, is that right?
No, we got married later.
Oh, you were not married at the time?
At the time, but
Communicated by letter?
yes, and he came to see me about once every 3 weeks.
It's quite a ways down there.
Because, see, I wasn't there by then. I was in Mount Vernon by then.
In Mount Vernon, which is about 100 miles away from here, but you still had to go quite a ways to see
So
him.
we didn't see each other every week, but almost.
Right. And then you got married. When did you get married and where?
Well, we got married in Indiana. Had a minister friend there who'd always, that I'd known for quite a long time, and had some college friends. And we didn't do this big wedding stuff because in Depression times and poor folks didn't do big weddings.
Not at all.
The four of us just went, we had the arrangements made, and the four of us went to the minister, and we were married, and then we went out for dinner, and that was it.
You're lucky you went out for dinner.
Yeah, I know.
Because there wasn't any money for dinner. What were teachers making in Twin City and when you first started to teach?
When I got $900 for my
For an
for
entire
9
year?
months.
For 9 months, so $100 a month.
$100 a month.
And how many students did you have?
Well, let's see. I had 6 grades. It was just the year that Twin Township was consolidating, and it was the last year they had these little buildings all over the township. And I had grades 1 through 6.
You had all 6 grades?
And I had 26 students.
26 students, so you taught in a kind of a one-room school, right?
And then before the year was out, they finished the building and they took my 5th and 6th grades. I'd rather they'd have taken my first and
second, and third.
in a way, because I had a lot to learn to do that. I hadn't trained for little children.
For early childhood,
But
right.
I liked that.
But you were able to teach all 6 grades. You had 26 of them. Have you seen any of those students that you had in that first year recently?
Yes. And I'll tell you what one of them said to me.
Okay, let me hear.
He's retired now from his big furniture and hardware store.
What is an
in this little town down at Bainbridge, Ohio.
Bainbridge.
And I see him when I go home to the Fall Festival of Leaves. And I always go into his store to see him. And I also go to the Methodist Church for their cornbread and bean soup dinner, because if there's anybody around that I still know, I get to see them there.
Right, of course.
Anyway, he came up to me and he said to some people, I had her in 2nd grade. And he said, here she still is, and I thought she was old then. And I said,
I can relate to that.
I know what you mean. And I said, I was old then. I was 19.
That's right. And as far as he was concerned, you were an old lady.
And so, but he always has to come up and see me and talk to me and tell me how nice I was.
And he
so
probably
forth.
was quite successful as a result of
Oh, yeah. Well, I always tell him that I'm the one who made him what he was.
That's
but
right.
That was a joke, too.
Well, far from it. I'll bet you did help to make him what he was. The other questions that I have concerning your earlier days were the ones that occurred here in Wadsworth. Do you remember what Jim was making in 1936 as a high school teacher? And high school teachers made more than elementary teachers. I mean, that single salary schedule didn't come up until about
He made $1,200.
$1,200 for 12 months
He was paid 9 months then, but very few years later, Norton went on the 12-month
12
pay.
months, but they paid, but you didn't get any extra money. They just
Oh, no,
made
just
the
spread it out
paychecks-
over 12
Made the paychecks of the
And,
less.
and we paid $25 a month rent for a small house
Where
on
were you living?
Prospect Street,
On Prospect.
166 West Prospect
You know
Street.
who owned the house?
Bill Collier.
Bill Collier. Oh, my heavens, really?
Mm-hmm.
He had a daughter, oh, mercy, I can't think of her name. She'd be about 69 years old now.
I didn't know the daughter. The son was Carl, and he was city engineer or city
Oh,
something
wait,
or other.
different, another Collier family then.
uh-huh,
Okay, all right,
okay.
fine. And you rented from him.
Yes.
And then, did you begin teaching in Wadsworth at that time?
No, I couldn't.
Why? Because you were married.
I was married.
So
I substituted at Franklin first, Miss Treffinger.
you had the substitute.
I had to
That's the only thing
substitute.
that you're allowed to do
Oh,
is be the
yes, right,
substitute.
uh-huh.
You could not get a job. Do you remember what substitutes were getting a day in those days?
$5.
$5 a day. Wow.
And it was terrible to sit around and wish for someone to be sick so I could make $5.
And how did you get your message? Did you have a telephone?
No.
How did you get your message?
Dr. Melvin lived catty corner across the backyard, and he had a phone, and
They called him.
they'd call him. He said,
would come
I said
over.
one day, I must get a phone because I want a substitute. And he said, well, if you think you can't afford a phone, he said, I have to have one. He was a chiropractor there.
Yes, Dr. Melvin's
And
daughter was one of our
he said,
guests.
I will never be worried if I have to come over to your house at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock. I'll call you anytime, so give my phone number.
Wasn't that nice of him?
And well, it was very nice. I appreciated that.
That's something that you don't have happen anymore.
No.
No. So Dr. Melvin would call you, and you would go running in and
I'd go to
substitute.
Norton, Sherman, Loyal Oak, and Wadsworth. I put my name in all those places.
And did you get much substituting?
Well, I thought it was a good year when I'd make $100
For the whole year?
for the whole year.
Wow. Now that's something.
And you may remember Portia Snyder.
Very
Portia
good,
Moon.
yes. What was her maiden name?
Moon, M-O-H-N.
Right.
And she, poor soul, I felt bad for her. She had a tonsillectomy and she hemorrhaged. And I taught 3 weeks for her. And I'd never taught 2nd grade. but I had the best time learning how to do second grade. And she came back, and she was back a week, and she was out again for another week. And I said to her, they don't pay you when they pay me? And,
Did they?
and she said, no, but she said, I will get, I've forgotten what it was, a little later on, because there I was beginning to feel guilty that I was getting $5 a day, and I don't suppose she was making much more than that at the time.
Oh, I'm sure she wouldn't have been, but she probably, at one time, substitutes had to pay their teachers.
Had to pay their own.
Had to pay their own, if you got them. That really cut down on the number of absenteeisms that we had.
Oh, I know. I waited one time 7 weeks for $10 from somebody I substituted for.
7 weeks.
And I wouldn't go ask. I told Mr. Isham once I then hadn't been paid, but I never would go ask.
Now, you taught for Vernon V. Isham. How about describing some of the teachers in that building and Vernon V. Isham, too? Who were some of the teachers in that building that you remember?
Well, let's see, Vera Vermillion.
Vera Vermillion, who was the
Mary
wife
Claggett.
of
Lou Vermillion.
Lou
who was up
Vermillion's
at
wife
Sharon.
from Sharon
Yeah.
Center. He was the superintendent of Sharon Center,
And Mary Claggett,
whose husband was the
superintendent
of Medina.
Medina Schools.
Right.
And May Vining.
H. May Vining, who was who lived right next door to the school,
Yeah.
right behind the school.
Well, this is when I substituted. Mrs. Vining wasn't there at the time I was regular teacher. Let's see, and of course, Mrs. Burbeck.
Velma Burbeck,
Yeah, Leora Hale.
Leora Hale.
And
Now, we
then-
hadn't heard that name before. How long
Well,
did she teach
taught
there?
third grade out there quite a little while.
Leora Hale. Spell it for us.
H-A-L-E.
H-A-L-E.
Her husband was Edward Hale. He taught in Barberton.
Okay.
And, of course, Dorothy Huff was in the sixth grade
Dorothy
there
Huff
all
taught
the time.
for 100 years, forever, right.
And when I taught sixth grade out there before I went up to the junior high, she was in the room next to mine. And I had a lot of fun with her. She couldn't understand my noise. And
No, she would not understand anybody's noise.
and
Matter of fact,
I would have times when I would apologize because I'd said this or done that, because I would shock her when I would tease children or go in the boys' restroom and slam everybody out because they were wetting paper towels and throwing them on. She said, "Why, you don't go in the boys' restroom?" And I said, "Yes, I do."
Oh, yes, you did.
And I embarrassed her sometimes, but she was there. And Levon Coppas was there.
Levon Cop, lovely, lovely
Oh,
soul.
most wonderful person.
Oh, yes. She has 4 children. And believe it or not, two of her children are in teaching, and both are retired now.
I know. I said when Virgil.
Roger and Virgil.
I went to the. Roger farmed,
Yes.
but he didn't teach.
Oh, didn't he teach?
No.
Oh, I thought that he taught.
No, he didn't teach that I know of. But anyway, when I went to Medina County Retired Teachers and they introduced Virgil and said he'd retired, I went up. I said, "You're just a kid. You can't retire yet."
That's right. Well, he was just a kid, too.
I know,
He's past 60, though.
And Levon taught there, and there was a.
She taught math, too.
Well, she taught 5th grade when I was out there. But she had taught Latin in high school before she was
Yes.
married.
She's a beautiful woman.
So anyway, and then later on, Lucille Holcomb taught 5th grade out there
Lucille
when I was
Holcomb.
out there.
That's right. That would be Ray's wife, Ray Holcomb, who was
And
the
of course,
principal.
after I went up to teach the junior high, I just taught 6th grade 2 years. When I went up to teach the math, and I tell this, that all good men teachers want to be principals.
Right.
And so, of course, that happened to George Meyer. Mr. Isham wanted him to come up, and I call it come up. And I said, I didn't cry one bit. I inherited his math job, and
that's
I
what
lived
you
there
wanted.
happily ever after. That's what I wanted, but I had to wait my turn.
Who else was teaching at the time there in the junior high?
Mr. Mahuta was art teacher.
Danny Mahuta.
Danny Mahuta.
From
and
Baldwin
he
Wallace
was-
College.
Right, And Stan Kuhn was teaching
Stan
shop,
was teaching shop.
Yeah.
And Stan Kuhn then became the superintendent of the schools.
and he taught shop. And Fran Rada taught home ec.
Fran Rada, now gone.
Yes,
Oh,
she's
beautiful
gone out.
woman.
Bernice Perkins from Medina taught
Right.
up in the junior high. Lyle Messner taught science.
Yes, indeed. These are names that haven't come out before. You're a wealth of knowledge here, Mrs. Bebout.
Well, I came from a long ways back,
Well, I guess so, 64 years.
but I'm glad I can still remember some of them. But
Was Lionel Emmerich there at the time?
Emmerich.
He taught.
I know the name, but I don't
His wife
remember.
taught 3rd grade, and he taught.
They weren't there when I was there full time,
yeah.
anyway.
And what about Vera Mulholland?
Well, she taught uptown when I did.
Did
when
she?
I went when we consolidated schools, then all the junior high went uptown, and I went up there then.
To the high school, to
what is now Central.
the Central
Yeah.
School.
And
Vera Mulholland was my math teacher.
oh, was she?
Admired her. She probably got all of her gray hair from
you?
trying to teach me some math, but she was an excellent math
Yeah,
teacher.
she and I were.
The irony of it is that I married a woman, Linda, who taught math at the university. My daughter is just inches away from getting a PhD in math.
Oh, good.
My one son is getting another PhD in medical economics in the area of mathematics, and my other son is a computer expert with a math background. And the only one of the whole family who doesn't have a math background is Dad, right here.
Dad has other good backgrounds, though.
Well, we get along, but I just wish that I could tell Mrs. Mulholland that maybe she instilled something in my genetic traits that helped my kids, but then my wife probably gave them all the... Tell us a little bit more about Mr. Isham.
Well, I just thought he was great. He appeared sometimes to be severe, but he wasn't really. He had a lot of sympathy for kids and empathy, and he wanted what was good for them, but I never was afraid of him. I mean, I had a good time with him, and I always felt you could just take anything to him and tell him anything that you wanted about youngsters and ask him things if you needed to, but I thought he was so good. And he laughed. One time we had a supervisor from Columbus, and they were coming up the steps to go around to the various rooms in the building I was in, and I heard Mr. Isham say, "Now we'll go visit Mrs. Bebout, and if you don't want to know what she thinks, don't ask her." And I thought, gee.
I can understand that one too. You have the reputation for being a very effusive, direct, powerful, effervescent, focused woman. Now, please understand that as small children, we didn't quite couch it that way, nor did we put such a positive spin on it. But you were extremely strict, probably one of the strictest teachers I've ever had.
Well, I had a student teacher a number of years later who asked me one day if he could bring 6 other men student teachers from University of Akron to visit me.
Do you remember who that student teacher was?
Herbert Young.
Herbert Young.
And he taught at Triway or someplace for a while till he quit and went into furniture business with his father-in-law. I think that's what he did. Anyway, I said, why would you want to bring anybody to visit me? And he said, none of them believe you can be that strict.
Oh, I can.
and have youngsters still like it.
Oh yes, we still loved you, but you were extremely strict.
And he said, they don't believe people teach that way anymore.
Well, you surely did.
And so anyway, he brought 7 young men one day to spend the day with us. And they had a good time.
While we're talking about discipline, what was your favorite form of discipline? How did you handle it? Now we are being somewhat honest here. However, we need to say also that you probably were one of the most concerned teachers we ever had too.
Well, I was.
But what was the secret of your discipline, outside of the fact that in your own mind there was just no messing around, and it was black or white and nothing gray?
Well, I guess maybe I mellowed a bit later, but not too much. I just maintain you can't learn if you're not moderately in the mood. And you can't do that by horsing around and throwing paper and being impolite and disrespectful. And so I would say we don't do that.
And as I remember, you never had a problem disciplining anybody. Big, small, doesn't make any bit of difference.
Well, you see, after you do this for a year or two and you stay in the same school, the word goes down, you don't mess around when you get to her.
Well, they didn't.
And so I I said, I think the last 15 years, I probably used the paddle once, and I probably sent only 2 or 3 ever to the office because I maintained the office didn't need to bother.
You could handle it yourself.
And I didn't mean to be mean. I thought I wasn't mean, but I hear people say, gee, you were strict.
Oh, yes. Yes,
And
you
here,
did say
see,
that.
I thought I wasn't strict. I thought Miss Huff was strict.
Well, Miss Huff was strict. She was extremely strict. I had her too.
I know.
As a matter of fact, you prepared me for her when you were substituting, and then you didn't spend too many days substituting.
Well, I tell you where I learned that business. My dad was strict, and the kids liked him, and they learned a lot. And I had 2 high school teachers who were very strict, and I liked them so well, and I learned. And I had 2 women teachers who I felt were half afraid of the students. And so it was hard work to learn in there. It wasn't that they didn't know and couldn't teach, it was just that there was always so much noise and so much this and that.
Talking about lovely, lovely teachers who were sweet, genuine, and affectionate. How about Elvina Steiner? Do you remember her?
I just briefly remember her.
Yeah,
but
she was such a sweet, she was a saint, an absolute saint, just a wonderful English teacher. We're going to get back to your teaching, but we have to get on with several more questions, or we will run out of time, as we always do. What about your family? You and Jim got married, and you didn't stop there. You had some children. And let's hear about those children.
Well, I had a son, John, in 1941, and he went to Wadsworth High School, and then later he went into the Navy, and was in the Navy, I think, 22 years.
22 years. John is a tall young man with no hair.
No hair,
just
like their
exactly like
dad.
his father. And his father had been in the Navy.
Yes.
And tell us about that experience, because right after you were married, or shortly after you were married, then he had to go to the service.
He went in, John was 3 years old when he went to the Navy. He waited and waited because he thought he was old enough. And finally, he and Walter Dick and Dale Guiley and Dick Curtis were all drafted at the same time.
And all of them are in their 80s right now.
And, well, the ones who are still living.
Yeah, Dick Curtis is still living.
Yeah.
Dale Guiley is gone.
Is gone, and Walter Dick's gone.
Dick is gone.
But anyway, those 4 went to the draft board. And it was a joke around the house because every time we'd bring up the subject of his having to go, I'd say, oh, I don't want you to go to the Army. And just for fun, kidding him because he knew I didn't want him to go. And he came home and he said, well, you got your wish. He said, I don't have to go to the Army. Oh, I was so excited. But he said, I'm going to the Navy.
Wow.
That was Jim, of course.
Yeah, he had a wry sense of humor.
And so that July, he was sent to Plattsburgh. And I take my little 3-year-old boy and get on the train, and we ride to Plattsburgh, and we rent a room.
In New York.
In New York. And so we stay in this one room, and every evening we go out on the bus to the base, and we can have an hour with Jim. And then he goes to Harvard for training. I've forgotten what they called those officers that didn't have much training, but he was personnel man. I mean, with his college work and all the background he had, they thought they could put him here or there. So.
90-day wonders.
90-day wonders, that's right. And anyway, so then we went to Harvard and stayed 3 months. And then we went to Fort Lauderdale, Miami Beach.
Miami Beach.
And from there we went to San Diego. And San Diego was the worst because, as I said, I left my little boy with my mother, and I go on the train with Jim to San Diego, but I cried all the way out because I left my little boy.
Well, of course.
And cried all the way back home because I left Jim to go to Okinawa and such. So that went that way.
Those were some very severe days in relationships. But
so I came back and began teaching school again.
And then Jim got out of the service when? 48?
40. No, he got out before that. He got out, he was overseas. I think he went in. Well, anyway, isn't that funny? I knew that. 45, I think he must have gone. When was Japan Day, VJ Day.
August of 45.
Okay, then he came home the next April. That was 46. He got home in April of 46.
Okay. Then he began teaching in Norton again, is that correct?
Yes, he went back to Norton.
And things started to get a little bit
Better. Yeah.
And where were you living at the time here in Wadsworth when you did come back to teach?
202 Highland Avenue.
And whose house was that?
Well, that was June and Oscar Bowers' house when we bought it.
Right.
And I've forgotten I don't know who all's owned it since, but I know that at one time Phil Croyle.
Phil Croyle had it.
Owned it
That's
for a
right,
while,
that's
right.
And you began then...
Glenn Freeburn and his wife owned it first.
Right.
They bought
Okay.
it from us.
From the Freeborns,
Yeah.
right? However, now at this time, the laws had changed and you could get a full-time job.
Well, the war wanted you.
That's right. So you...
The men were gone and they
That's
wanted
right.
women.
So you got a full-time job. And where was the full-time job?
Isham,
At Isham School. And there, how long were you there then, all that time?
11 years.
11 years. And who was the principal then?
Well, Mr. Isham was until
He
he
came
died,
back.
and then it was George Meyer.
Yeah, but Vernon Isham was in the service too.
Yeah, too, but he had come back. Mabel
Heinemann Becker.
Heinemann. I couldn't think of Heinemann. I could think of Becker, yes.
Mabel Heinemann
she
Becker.
took it over during the time of the
And
war.
Eugenia Foote took it after
Yes,
her, after she
her,
had it.
uh-huh.
And then when Vernon V. Isham came back, then Eugenia Foote stepped out, stepped down, which, did she leave? Okay. And then Vernon V. Isham took it over in 1945, I believe. He became the principal again.
I didn't go back till 1951.
51, so he was the principal then.
Yeah.
Now, when you said that when Vernon V. Isham died, would you discuss for a few minutes about the post-war centralized school, which is now Isham School, and then tell us about the amalgamation or the consolidation of the two schools where they joined together, and Vernon V. Isham's role then?
Well, I don't know that I know how much about the role they played, but we knew that when we combined that 7th, 8th, and 9th grade would no longer be at Isham School.
And they went...
And that's when those of us who wanted to go went up to Central.
And you went?
And I went.
And who was the principal there then?
Richard Holmes.
Richard Holmes. This is the old building.
The old building.
Now, again, we're going to come back to this, but let's get on with your family. By this time, you have a John who was what, in 1950, he was probably 9 or 10 years old, 9 years old. And then he went to the Wadsworth schools. And did he have any brothers or sisters?
Well, we had a pre-war and a post-war. Had Carl, who was born in 1947.
47.
And he lives in Mesa. He's married and has 2 children.
And tell us a little bit about Carl and who he looks like.
Well, he looks more like his grandfather Bebout than he does like his father, but he's bald like the 2 of them, and he's really tall, too.
The Bebouts are very tall. Jim was what, 6'3" or 4"? 6'4", and John is how tall?
About 6'2" and a half.
And then John has a beautiful daughter who's also tall.
And she's 6 feet tall.
6 feet tall, just a gorgeous person.
And he has one son who is 6'4".
6'4".
And has one son who is 6'7".
And he has one son who's 6'7". So the tallest people in Wadsworth are probably
Bebouts.
the Bebouts, that's right. And what does John do now?
Well, he works for a motorcycle place in Worcester. He's parts man. He knows enough about computers. He can do the parts stuff, and he
computers,
likes
that's right.
that. He doesn't work full time in the winter, but he works full time all summer.
But is he living in Wadsworth now?
He lives in Wadsworth
And where
on
does he live in
Summit Street.
On where?
Summit Street.
On Summit Street.
And his wife Sonia teaches at Overlook.
Right. And Sonia is, who was she?
Neshef. Sonia Neshef.
Right.
She graduated
And
also
she's
from Wadsworth.
From Wadsworth, and she is a teacher at Overlook School
first
right
grade.
now. Let's go back to Vernon V. Isham just for a couple of minutes and tell us as much as you can about him, his family, his child, the one who died, the only one that they had. These are the personal things which we probably will not find in history books, and I think it's important for us to know the travails that this poor man went through all of his life. Do you remember about that?
Well, I remember one of the things he told me, and I've thought of it so many times ever since. He would tell me, I remember the first time he told me that his little girl would never sit up.
Okay, now they had a baby girl.
Baby girl, Sandra.
Sandra, and she was born approximately when?
Well,
After the war.
It was after the war.
Somewhere
So it
close.
had to be, I think she was a year or so older than Carl.
Right,
She
so
must
she
have been
probably
born in
1945,
45 or so, I
46,
think.
somewhere in that area. And with
And-
his wife Miriam Isham,
And she taught,
M-I-R-I-A-M,
and she taught, her name was Fenstermaker.
Fenstermaker from Akron.
And she taught in Akron. I think
Now,
it's Central.
Vernon, yes, she at Central indeed. Vernon V. Isham was married before he went to the service,
Yes, oh yes.
but they didn't have any children
No,
until
and
he
that's
got
why
back.
uh-huh.
And when he got back, how old would Vernon V. Isham be now?
Oh, he was older than Jim, so he'd be 90 or so.
90. So in 1945,
He was 38 when he was drafted.
38 when he was
And
drafted.
that was supposed to be the limit on
That's
draft.
right. So they didn't have any children until he's about 40 years of age, somewhere in that area. I'm just trying to establish
Yeah.
that there were no children ahead of
No.
time. And then when Sandra was born, she was born with what is spina bifida?
Well, she hadn't developed except in length. They call it, or at least they called it then, bird hands, Everything was so tiny.
Tiny.
She never did grow really tall, but she was a perfectly normal looking baby up until she was about 5 or 6 months old, and then they began to notice that she didn't do things that any other.
Right.
And so then began a year and a half or 2 years of specialists and this, and they finally had to accept that she would never develop.
And she died at age probably 12
11.
or 13. 11?
I think it was
Okay.
11.
I knew it was...
She began to have so many, I guess I call them seizures or spasms, and Mrs. Isham's health was just deteriorating by trying to lift the child and do all of these things, and the doctors advised them to put her in a hospital. So she was in a private place in Akron for quite a long time, and that was just eating up both their incomes.
Of course it would.
And so they took her to Columbus, but she didn't, and she wasn't mistreated or anything. They went to Columbus every week to see her, but she got pneumonia.
And she died.
But anyway, I said to him at school about how sorry I was, in a way, and he said, well, we feel like it in a way. But he said, no child is a mistake.
No, no.
You know, and the way he said, and he says, and I know there are some things, and probably many things that are worse than dying.
Yeah, I'm sure that would be true. And they went through it. They had a horrible time for that whole period of time. But they bore up very well with it.
Yes.
Then Vernon V. Isham lived for another 5 or 6 years. I think he
he
died in
lived
1956 or 7, somewhere in that
I
area.
can't remember when, but I remember that, because they kept her mother for 13 years.
Yes.
And
Mrs. Fenstermaker.
And I remember this being, I thought this was one of the saddest things other than losing
A child.
a child. In a way, it was sad. They bought a little cottage up on Lake Erie. And he said, we're having people to housewarm it. And he said, we'll invite you. We want you and Jim to come, but we want you to bring the pies.
Because you bake pies.
So this was funny because I'd make pies for school things. And so we were getting there were 6 couples of us. We were all going to go spend the weekend at their cottage and everything. And that week before, they were supposed to go to a wedding. And he said he just wasn't feeling too well, and he guessed he'd lie down a while before they got ready to go. And she went up to the room to say, Vern, Red, you better get up. It's about time to get ready. And he didn't answer, and she went over, and he was making strange noises, and before you know it, he was dead.
Dead. So you never went to the housewarming?
Never had a housewarming. He never got to spend any time.
Never got to spend any time in that cottage.
And you see, they couldn't do these things when they had the mother who had the stroke and
Of
lived
course.
there. And so this they had done, and I felt so bad that they planned one vacation, the first vacation they'd had in all those years,
Right,
and they couldn't
didn't
get
make
it.
it.
And
He
I
was,
always felt that was
at
bad.
that time, probably 60 years of age. And not a minute younger than that.
No.
At least that, because I think that would have been in 1955 or 6 or
like
somewhere,
something in there,
somewhere in that area. Miriam Isham is still living, I believe, is she not?
As far as I know.
Yes, and she is probably 90 years old
Oh,
also.
I would imagine.
But a brilliant woman. All the Fenstermakers were brilliant.
were.
And then they have a nephew, Dwayne Isham, who's a very outstanding attorney in Akron.
Akron,
Right. Tell us as much as you can tell us about Mabel Heinemann Becker.
I can't tell you an awful lot about her because I wasn't in the building except substituting when she was there.
I knew her quite well, as a matter of fact.
And I always thought she was so capable and always so friendly and nice. But I didn't know other things about her.
She was very friendly. She's a beautiful face, yes. A little on the heavy side, but that was part of her beauty. I think she's just a very nice person. And stern, strict, but very warm and cordial. And she owned the El Commodore, which is a little restaurant. So geographically, the AC Field is right adjacent to the El Commodore. Now it's Bradley's, but at that time it was a small diner type of a thing. And she married a fellow by the name of Becker. And do you remember that story about Mr. Becker?
No, I never knew that. I guess if I did, I'd forgotten.
Mr. Becker went to the doctor, and I think that he went to the doctor across from the post office at that time. And the doctor said, "You're fine. Everything's great." He walked out and he dropped over dead. So her only husband, and he died just almost instantly. Mr. Becker, I believe, was a salesman for food goods. I'm not positive. Food goods at Wadsworth Centralized School, and she met him there. And that was about the end of it. They got married, and nice man. I knew him quite well too.
Did you?
Then Eugenia Foote had a husband who had tuberculosis. And do you remember anything about Eugenia Foote, the principal there?
The thing that I remember at the time, it was so surprising they hired a married woman.
Right. Oh, is that right?
Yes,
it would have been that much of a problem at that time.
Because,
Still?
I mean, they had a few who were married, but they didn't hire anybody new who was married. And of course, it came out then that she had a husband who was ill, and she had to make a living and all.
Right.
And then, of course, she was the wartime principal.
Yes, she was.
See, she became the principal when Mr. Isham was in the service.
She was from Pennsylvania, and she had a sister who was a military, I think, Wave or I believe a Wave,
like that,
yes.
but I don't remember that too much.
And her name is Edith. Edith. And Eugenia Foote drove a 1936 Ford four-door blue car with the trunk on the back of it.
Well, you remember a lot more about her than I did.
I remember all those kinds of things. I remember that Vernon V. Isham used to drive a light green, kind of a lime green Chevrolet coupe years ago. And Bertha Kuhn drove a 1931 Ford coupe as well.
You ought to get with my John. He loves cars.
Well, I love cars, and I do remember people by their cars. Let's get back to Jim for a little while and tell us a little bit about Jim. And we mentioned his humor. Tell us a little bit about the wry humor that Jim Bebout had and how it affected various people.
Well, I wouldn't know where to start. I guess one of the things that I tell that I think's funny, of course I had a million of them over the years, when he wasn't well and he sat in the den a lot in his chair, sometimes I'd think of something I wanted him to do that he could do. I never asked anything very big of him after he'd been ill. Anyway, he saved boxes. He saved
cardboard boxes.
He saved anything you might need again someday.
I know that.
And the garage was full, and I was cleaning the garage. And I finally said, I'm going to get him. And I go in the house and I yell, "Hey, Jim, somebody out here wants to see you." And he gets up and he comes out the garage and he looks all around and he wants to know who wants to see him.
Oh, you wanted to see him?
He said, "What do you want?" I said, "I'll give you half an hour to decide how many of those boxes I can get rid of while I'm cleaning this garage." So he got busy and sorted. And on the way in the house, he muttered, 46 years and I still don't know what to expect. Just, you know.
That's the way you were too?
And that's the way he would say things, you know, just something real funny like that.
Jim and I worked together at football games in Norton.
Yeah.
And I guess the parking lot or the driveway was cinders, and a lot of dust when had a big, particularly if it was dry weather or so forth and so on. And we were playing Copley that night, and the Copley fans, I guess, were really dead sure that they were going to be winning, and they were a little on the cocky side. And a woman came across the parking lot, and she was late. And the game had already started. She was late. And she said, is Copley winning yet? And Jim looked up and said, well, if my seafaring eyes don't, I can trust my seafaring eyes, I'm looking at the scoreboard where I don't think Copley is playing. So what do you mean Copley's not playing? Am I at the wrong places? No, by the looks of the score, Copley's not playing.
Yes, that sounds like it.
He had just a wry sense of humor and kind of a nasality to it, which really gave it a character, as we remember. Jim passed on when?
1981, November.
And you said that he was ill. He had been sick for quite some time before he passed on, did he not?
Well, he had in 1978, he'd had 2 heart attacks,
Right.
but he got over that and was able to do a lot of things. We took a lot of trips and did various things like that. But in June of 81, he kept on having chest pains and kept going back to the doctor. And I said, Jim, I don't know, maybe you have pneumonia again. He'd had pneumonia once. And so they did a lot of x-rays and tests and such and found out he had cancer.
Cancer.
So he died in November.
That was too bad. Just a good friend of everyone. Going to the junior high school now, when you were transferred during 1940, what,
51.
51.
No, not 51, 61.
61 to the junior high school. What was going on there, and who were some of the teachers that you remember in the junior high school?
Well, Dick Holmes was principal.
Dick Holmes, of course, became the superintendent. Then he became the superintendent of Green Local, which is in Smithville.
Yeah.
Smithville.
Well, let's see. And I was trying to think. I know, as I mentioned part of them, because they kept coming.
Was Gene Lyron there at the time?
No, Gene Lyron was never at the junior high when I was, except summer school.
Okay.
He had moved
to the high school.
To the high school.
Taught math.
Gene Moyne.
Gene Moyne
Was a math teacher. Laurel Mast.
Laurel Mast was what?
Math teacher.
Math teacher as well. He was also the athletic director later on.
But later on he was math. And Elva Bolden was English, and Alberta Messam
Okay,
was English.
Elva Hartman Brintlinger Baldwin.
Right.
Right. And she still has a lot of relatives. The Groovers are all her relatives.
They all live around here,
Yes,
yes.
right.
And Mr. Messner was science at first. Carl Neff came later to do science.
And who was the custodian at that time?
Bill Ream, but who was? Gene Morgan was once.
Gene Morgan had been a prince or a custodian for what, 40 some odd years?
I don't know.
45 years
but Bill
ago.
Ream was there most of the time when
Right.
I was.
We had Bill Ream on this program.
I know you did. I saw him. And I'm trying to think.
What about Mr. Cheney? Was he there at the time?
I don't remember any Mr. Cheney.
Mr. Cheney was at the high school 50 some odd years, well, about 60 to 70 years ago.
No, I don't.
And I remember him as 50 years ago at least, 55.
I don't know them, but I was trying to think. Is that funny? You know them all. Helen Gilbert taught Latin.
Helen Gilbert taught Latin.
Latin, yes, she was there. I go down.
She lived out in Weavertown.
Helen?
Weaverville, which was Helen Gilbert lived out in Weaverville.
No, she lived right here on Highland Avenue.
Well, didn't she live
You're
out?
thinking about Rosemary Gilbert,
Oh, Rosemary Gilbert?
and she didn't teach at the junior high any.
Okay. Then this is Helen Gilbert.
Helen Gilbert, who,
And she had a son, did she not?
no, she had a daughter, Jane.
Daughter, okay, wrong one.
Yeah, it's wrong one.
But she taught Latin.
And she taught Latin
Okay.
at the junior high. And who else? Don Johnson taught seventh grade
Don Johnson was there
English.
1,000 years.
Yes.
We had Don Johnson here as one of our
Did
guests.
you? And he taught there when I
He
was
was in
there.
the junior high school building longer than any other person in Wadsworth because he went there,
Went there,
you know,
right.
as a student.
We
and
had a
taught
science
there.
teacher before Carl Neff called Brian Stoltzfus. And then he
Let's
went.
spell Stoltzfus for us.
Oh, don't.
S-T-O-L-Z-F-U-S.
Okay, and there's a Z in there before the
Is there?
F-U-S, right.
Okay, F-U-S-Z.
S-T-O-L-Z.
S-T-L-Z-F-U-S, okay.
Stoltzfus. Anyway, he went up to the high school. When they brought us sixth graders and took our ninth graders, when they built the new high school, then we lost Elva and we lost some of those. that we'd had down at Central for quite a while.
But you had the high school there at that building, right?
We did. I never taught at Central when it was high school.
Oh, always junior high school.
It's always junior, but after they consolidated and built the new high school, then 10th, 11th, and 12th grades went up to the new high school, and all the 7th, 8th, and 9th graders in the district came to Central.
What about Trudy McDaniel?
Well, Trudy came there to teach. She taught English, but not right at first.
But you taught
Yeah,
with
was
her.
there, yes, taught with
Trudy
her.
was the president of the Wadsworth Area Historical
I
Society.
know, I know,
As a matter- I
uh-huh.
took it over. Well, I didn't really take it over. They pushed it on to me, as you understand.
Oh, I'll bet.
They did. And the elections came up the other night, and I understand that I'm president for another year.
Well, good for you.
I made them promise they wouldn't run me in a primary. They absolutely cannot get anyone to do it.
I
And I'm so happy to be associated with the Historical Society. And what about, who was teaching French at the junior high school? Was anyone teaching French when you were there?
We didn't have French.
Just Latin only?
Just Latin.
And no French and no Spanish?
No Spanish.
And what about music?
We had lots of music. Gene Lawrence came to teach band at first and then vocal.
Gene Lawrence, who's now retired.
Now retired, yes, he came there then. Of course, he was out at Isham too when I was.
Was he, really?
Yes, he taught at Isham in Seville when he first came to the district. He was a Medina County teacher, as we
Oh, I
called
see.
ourselves
Yes,
then.
right.
And then when we consolidated, and King Sears was the high school.
He was still there.
Vocal.
King Sears was still at the
Yes,
high school.
And Gene was at the junior high when I was, when I
Okay.
began there.
And then,
And then, what
what
Gene-
about the sciences? We haven't come to the sciences yet, except for Neff,
Neff and Messner.
Messner.
And I think they were the only two we had all the time I was there.
Right. Now, who were the secretaries in the office at the junior high school?
Well, we
at the
had
time?
Jean Holcomb.
And she was on our program,
I know
too.
she was. And Jean was there, and Doreen, is her name Doreen? Daniels, Jerry Daniels' mother. Lois Kreider, Charles Kreider's wife, was
Wife,
secretary
Lois
there for
Kreider.
quite a while. Who else? We always had two. Oh, Schneider, Ruth Schneider.
Ruth Schneider.
Mary Heil's sister.
Mary Heil's sister,
Okay,
right?
that she was one of the secretaries. See, you have to go back quite a ways for me. I can't think of all of them right fast. Men's, we had a lady by the name of Ann Menz, I think she was, and then she moved to Mansfield.
Now, you had an assistant junior high school principal, too, did you not?
Yes.
And who was that?
Well, that was Dave Walters.
Dave Walters.
Until till Dick Holmes went somewhere else, and
That's
then
right.
Dave Walters
Dave became the
our
principal, and then Dave became the assistant superintendent.
Yes, right.
So he went right up, and of course,
And,
he's retired now, too.
And there was a while till he died. Ted Kramer was.
Ted Kramer was the principal
And
there.
then we had Charles Parsons, but I was gone. Charles Parsons was a teacher there while I was there.
Now,
but
you taught under Ted Kramer.
Yes.
And Ted died, and he had some kind of a rheumatic fever, a rheumatic disease, did he not?
I don't know what all he had wrong, but
Something was wrong. I had his whole family as a student, students at in Sherman many years ago. Going back to 1937, 38, 39, 40, when you began teaching in the area, you taught also in the Norton schools. And then substituted in the Norton schools, and you substituted in all the schools in Wadsworth. Is that correct? Do you remember the city as it was at that time, and the difference between what you remember when you left school and when you first began teaching in terms of parent involvement, lawsuits, all of those kinds of things? What do you remember?
I don't remember ever hearing of a lawsuit till late years.
Until late years. So that never occurred to anyone. No one.
And I guess the awful part that to parents nowadays would be that, as parents used to say, you get a paddling at school and you'll get one when you get home, because I send you to school to learn, not to make a fool of yourself.
That's right. And there was no, what about parent conferences and things like that? Did you have them in those days? No.
No, we had them once in a while if some youngster just didn't ever want to track, and the principal would say, you better come in. If we had a youngster who was having trouble, especially at junior high level, with all teachers, then that parent or parents were to come in and let us discuss it. And
What did
talk
the discussion sound like when you had a parent conference?
Well, one time I guess I was a little bit flip. one man told me, you can't believe this. One man said, "You're too nice. You smile too much. You
Oh,
need."
really? I can't believe that.
I know
no,
that.
I can't.
know. Anyway, when he finished with me, I said, "Well, now, I listened to your side of it. Here's my side of it. I can teach your child if you'll keep out of it."
Oh, you seem to be vacillating. You're talking this way and that. What did you mean by that?
Well, he was bugging his boy all the time. He wanted him to hurry up. He wanted it to look better. He wanted him to get finished. So the child was just really uptight all the time.
And did the man butt out, as it say?
Yes.
He did?
And I said, "If you leave him alone, I'll teach him." I said, "At least give me 6 weeks. And then if you don't like what I'm doing and you think I'm too nice to him," I said, "then I'll let you bug him all you want to." Well, at the end of that school year, he and his wife took Jim and me out to one of the nicest restaurants we'd ever been in. I got the nicest bouquet of flowers. I still have the letter.
No kidding.
And I had the next 2 sons because he would go down to the office and say, "My son has to be in that math class." And then I retired and I get the nicest letter and it says, "You can't do this to us. We have one more son." So I said, he didn't take it personally, but he believed me when I finally said, "If you'll leave him alone and let me teach him, we'll get along fine." Because he wasn't afraid of me, as you can't believe, but the youngster wasn't afraid of me.
Oh, I didn't say that I was afraid of you. I just respected
But
you
anyway,
very
I always
highly.
thought, I was too blunt, I know, many times. I still am. But that's
Well,
just the way I am.
Life is not a rehearsal. You have to get your point across right now. That's right.
As Mr.
Tell us,
Isham said, if you don't want to know what she thinks, don't ask
ask
her.
her because she'll tell you. How about reminiscing about some of the nicest, warmest, most cordial kinds of relationships and/or experiences that you had as a teacher in Wadsworth?
Oh, that's so hard. I told you beforehand about the one that told me that sent the girl to tell me that he still loved me.
Right. Well, let's hear that story. I think it's a beautiful story.
Well,
But no names, though.
no names,
No
I know.
names.
Well, I had this little boy who just couldn't ever sit still. And he was always up and walking and up to the window and, "Come and sit down now, come and sit down." And one day I said, "You're just my little wormy peanut. Someday I'll get you to stay put." Now this is a 14-year-old 8th grader. And the kids complained that he didn't smell so good, so I talked to him about that, and I got him some soap. And so
But how did you get him to use that soap? I think that's a good story right there.
I told him he was big enough to wash himself and that I knew his mother had too much to do, and so I gave him the soap and told him it was man soap.
Soap that men like.
That a man would smell like that, and he should do that, and he could be clean. And so he did, but he thanked me about it. And he said, "To pay you back, I'm going to stay in my seat, and I'm really going to try to do my math."
And he
Just
did.
right now, and he did. He was just a good boy.
And that was some 50,
He never had done anything bad. It's just that he was never where you wanted him.
and that's
when
some
you need
50
him.
years ago, right?
And oh yes.
And now, tell us what the sequel was just recently.
Well, it wasn't that recent when this girl came into my classroom years later, and she knew him, and he said, "Who's your 8th grade math teacher?" "Well, Mrs. Bebout." Well, he said, "I want you to tell her that her little old wormy peanut still loves her and wants to thank her for what she did for him."
Some 50 years
And that's one of
before.
my good stories.
And that's a good story. But are some of the other kinds of things that you remember that are so precious to you?
Well, this is what kids say, I think are probably more precious than anything else. This one still touches me. I had a group, and you don't call them slow groups, but they
That's what they
didn't do
were.
as well as others. And this one little boy he was so little for an 8th grader anyway, and he had so much trouble with math. And one winter, I had the flu, and I was out about 1 week and 2 days, and then I went back for 3 days, and then I was out another week. So anyway, the substitute said to me, "I hate going into that class because as that one group comes in and they stop at the door on a Monday morning, they say, 'No, not you again.'" So when I finally went back and they walked, it was first period class, they ran in And this one, he was such a little guy for 8th grade. He ran up and he hugged me and he said, "Oh, Mrs. Bebout, I'm so glad you're here." He says, "Now I'll learn something again."
Oh, bless his heart, that's wonderful.
And I guess what amused me was I thought deep down, well, sweetie pie, you haven't learned an awful lot so far.
But what would happen if you wouldn't have helped him there?
But I thought how nice that he was so tickled to see me. Of course, during that time, there'd been 3 different substitutes, and that isn't a good idea
No,
either,
it's not
but
a
you
good
can't help
idea.
it sometimes.
But they do become attached. Mrs.
But he-
Bebout, we have unfortunately come to the end of our hour.
Oh, good.
Believe it or not. And we want to say that all of the things we've said today are said in the spirit of love and affection, because the strictness, the directness, the effervescence, the focused admiration that you offered to so many of us over the years, for the past 60 years or so, have been probably those things which have brought us to the realization that there is a certain strength in discipline, and you certainly provided that for us. We want to thank you. The City of Wadsworth wants to thank you. And in the name of the thousands of students whom you have helped over these years, we want to say thank you and we love you. Thank you very much, Mrs. Bebout.